So thank you all for coming. And first, on behalf of my colleagues in the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources and the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies, we wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work here. It's also my pleasure today to welcome you to the last meeting of the Labor and Humanities Seminar hosted jointly by the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources and the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies here at the University of Toronto. It's been in some ways kind of a weird but productive semester, and I'm really glad to see so many people here today, including undergrads from my classes, colleagues from both of my home units here at U of T, and people from my wider scholarly community. So it's really really nice to see you all, and I hope it meets your expectations, which is why the onus is on Dr. Asheesh Siddique, who is our speaker for today, and who was actually supposed to be the second invitee in the first edition of the Labor and Humanities Seminar last year, a meeting which was, for scheduling conflicts, was derailed last spring. So we have him here virtually, which is, not quite the same as having him here in person, but I'm sure we'll get something out of it regardless. So Asheesh is assistant professor in the Department of History at the University of Massachusetts-Amherst. He received his PhD in 2016 in history from Columbia. He's also held appointments at the University of Southern California and Penn State. And he's working on a number of book projects. And the one that sort of he'll bring to the fore today is a book called Rule Through Paper, which is an archival and linguistic, a history of archival and linguistic knowledge as tools of governance in the British Empire that places a kind of explicit comparative lens on the experience of British administrators and bureaucrats in British India and in the Atlantic world. So we're really happy to have him here today. And he'll give a talk of about 40 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers afterwards. But for the moment, please give your attention to Dr. Asheesh Siddique. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Pedrick, for this very kind invitation. It's too bad that we couldn't meet in person, but I'm so honored to be here virtually and to have this opportunity to talk with you all. So I'm going to, there was an awkward moment in these things where you share your screen in order to show slides. So I'm gonna do that, and we'll put this on to the slideshow view. Okay, great. So hopefully you can all hear me, though if for whatever reason the thing goes off, just somebody gesticulate wildly and we'll sort it out. So thanks again to Pedrick and to everyone at the Center for Industrial Relations for having me. It's really great to be here. My talk today is called Archives, Expertise, and the Practice of Political Economy in the British Atlantic World. So if you want to know about the political economy of Canada or the United States today, finding answers is easy. Just point your browser to the website of Statistics Canada, the National Statistical Agency. If you're curious about the US, simply navigate to the website of the Bureau of Economic Analysis and look at the data projections listed on its website. On both sites, you will view data collected by government bureaucrats about things like gross domestic product, employment, and consumer spending. And if you want, you can combine the different statistical measures that you find on these different websites in order to come up with an account of the national economy. But if you wanted to know about the political economy of Canada or the United States in the 18th century, you would have a few problems. Not only did Canada and the United States not exist at that time, There were also no central statistical agencies that gathered data for governments anywhere in the Western European world. The first statistical agency in Britain, the General Register Office, was only founded in 1837. In the US, there was no permanent census agency until 1902. And in Canada, there was no statistical office until 1918. So where did people in the 18th century go when they wanted to determine economic fact? Over the last 20 or so years, historians have expended a great deal of effort in trying to answer this question. And they have shown that the answer is that nobody in the early modern Atlantic world could seem to agree on exactly how to determine such facts. If we were merely to look at the early modern British Atlantic, we would find a wide-ranging debate, not just over what fiscal and commercial policies would render the British Empire more economically successful than its imperial rivals, especially France and the Dutch and Spain, but also immense contestation between bureaucrats, political commentators, merchants, and commercial investors about what methods were valid for determining the facts on which such policies were to be based. In the last 20 years, scholarship has done a great deal to elucidate many of these methods, showing how their early modern advocates competed with each other by asserting that their mode of determining economic fact was true and superior to competing alternatives. From the observations of merchants championed by members of the Royal Society as trustworthy to the political arithmetic invented by William Petty to solve the problems of confessional difference in population in post-Restoration England, to political arithmetic's revision by Cotton Mather in colonial New England as a tool of theological inquiry, and by Charles Davenant in the early 1700s as an instrument of parliamentary dispute, writers, politicians, and bureaucrats debated, appropriated, and manipulated such methods in order to ground their arguments about economic policy on a quote unquote system of reasoning that they claimed produced authoritative political economic fact. But historians have had much less to say about the most important of these methods of determining economic fact, one that bears a great deal of resemblance to what historians today spend so much of their time doing, or at least spend time doing before the pandemic: archival research. The most powerful mode of political reasoning in the early modern European imperial world involved looking at the sometimes dusty, decaying, and moldy paperwork contained in official archives and trying to derive policy prescriptions from them. The reason that this archival method of policy and of political economy was so powerful was that it was the quotidian everyday practice of governments themselves. Beginning in the medieval period, governments across Europe began to conceive of administration as involving, fundamentally, the collecting, interpretation, manipulation, and dissemination of information as a primary mode of exercising and maintaining their power. Record creation, of course, had a long history in the regions that became Europe, but it was in this period, from about the 11th century, that record creation seems to have accelerated, with texts in many forms, from amulets, inscriptions, and scholarly compendia, to literary texts, charters, and written legal proceedings, accelerated, leading to the explosion not simply of collections, but also and specifically of archives, defined here as the loci for the collection and preservation of records in diverse documentary forms, such that, by virtue of controlling such institutions, the possessor exercised or claimed to exercise some form of political dominion. This claim that the possession and control of records was a necessary condition for the possession of political authority refracted itself into both medieval ecclesiastical and secular structures of governance. Beginning probably in the Italian city-states in the 15th century and spreading westward in the 16th century to France, Spain, and eventually England, bureaucrats developed a vision of government as a process of collecting and controlling information and configuring its interpretation, dissemination, and manipulation as fundamental to the exercise of rule. This early modern information state ruled, in fundamental part, by aspiring to control the flow of written records within bureaucratic systems, and to use these records as the basis on which to make sound policy decisions. In England, this particular link between power and knowledge initially materialized into practices of statecraft during the English Reformation during the 1500s. As part of his broader assertion of royal control against ecclesiastical power, King Henry VIII sought to seize control of all records related to administrative matters, especially against the competing sovereignty of the church. The historian Geoffrey Elton famously described Henry's moves as constituting a Tudor revolution in government, and that revolution extended to paperwork itself. Medieval ecclesiastical institutions had functioned as nodes in complex information networks filled with various forms of government and church paperwork. They had existed in tandem with a highly disaggregated official archive regime in the medieval English state. The profusion of offices and especially under the Tudor regime had resulted in different bureaucratic institutions developing their own procedures for storing records. But in 1536, Henry dissolved the monasteries and sent royal officials to seize their records as part of his process of asserting royal sovereignty over the church. Henry's successor, Elizabeth I, in 1578, chartered the Office of Her Majesty's Papers and Records for Business of State and Council, known as the State Paper Office, in which all documents produced by bureaucrats in the service of the state were supposed to be concentrated. Now, why did the Elizabethan regime care about controlling records at all? The reason lay in the growth of consciousness among Elizabethan courtiers and the particular value of what they referred to as experience. By experience, what was meant was a knowledge of the causes of events, a knowledge of the reasons why things happened in civil affairs. Unlike the knowledge of why God did things, which human reason could not fully render clear given its fallibility, the reason why humans did things ought to be decipherable, or so these early moderns thought. Indeed, the possibility that one could develop a knowledge of the causes of human events and human actions was one of the bedrocks of humanism. And this knowledge of civil affairs was thought within this humanistic frame of thinking about government, could be produced by correlating information about how people behaved in the present, which could be garnered through travel, observation, espionage, and resulting written descriptions from these activities, with authoritative bodies of evidence about how they had behaved in the past, which could be garnered by studying the voluminous records of ecclesiastical and civil government now concentrated in the State Paper Office. These conjoined ideas of the value of experience obtained through on-the-ground observation for governing and the possibility of deriving general principles of rule for governing based on analyzing these experiences appealed to the rulers of 16th century England as they sought to govern. So they began to construct an information order that facilitated both the collection of experience and the storage of experience in ways that it could be easily retrieved and consulted for political knowledge. The medium they relied upon to do this was paper. The rulers began to require that their servants in localities around England, local governors, magistrates, tax collectors, and other bureaucrats, produce written records documenting their activities and the state of the different parts of the territory, circulate these records back to central authorities who could read these documents and thereby learn about the condition of the territory and thus make more informed administrative decisions. And then in turn, file these documents in places that were beginning to be referred to in 16th century England as archives, places where records pertaining to governance were to be kept. Bureaucrats then sought to use these accumulating bodies of records as sources of knowledge and authority to inform their administrative and political decision-making by comparing incoming information to the growing body of records in these archives documenting the administrative past. This interrelationship between observation and history, description and archive, thus came to characterize the information regime of Elizabethan England at the end of the 16th century. To be an expert in affairs political, bureaucrats had to be archivally savvy, masters of accessing, using, and presenting these records to kings and queens in order to convince sovereigns to follow a particular line of policy. The expansion of the English state into the sphere of overseas administration in the Atlantic Ocean and in the Indian Ocean world from the beginning of the 17th century saw the application of this mode of archival reasoning to the governance of imperial affairs, though not without complications. Monarchs sought to offset the expense and risk of trade and settlement in far-flung maritime and territorial spaces by authorizing bodies of merchants and settlers to undertake these ventures on their behalf, while devolving significant powers of administration to the merchants and settlers themselves in exchange for a portion of any profits. This was the corporate form of governance. And over the course of the early 17th century, the Crown granted corporations written charters empowering them to settle trade, make laws, and collect taxes from inhabitants in specific geographic areas. In short, to do precisely the type of paper-intensive administrative activities that the sovereign had practiced domestically. Although this strategy allowed the Crown to expand English power in a cost-efficient manner, it also came at another cost. By exercising direct powers of administration, both corporations and proprietors controlled political information about the commercial opportunities presented by overseas expansion, potentially restricting what the state knew about such ventures. During the 17th century, English monarchs often endeavored to assert their authority in imperial affairs, over and against the very corporate forms that they had created. The sovereign's privy councillors, or board of advisors, manifested this determination when they challenged the autonomy of struggling or failing corporate ventures. Control of information formed part of that strategy. Just as the Privy Council had taken hold of the incorporated body of records of the medieval church in creating a state church during the English Reformation, as I was just discussing, it asserted authority over Atlantic world settlement and trade by seizing corporate paperwork and using such documents to inform administration. The Privy Council augmented this imperial archive as its administrative activities over the remainder of the 17th century generated a growing body of written documentation. The most fundamental of these activities involved appointing officials to execute the council's directives with respect to settlement and trade in the Atlantic world. Investing these bureaucrats with specific responsibilities and tasks for executing policy, the council demanded that they regularly provide written proof of their obedience to metropolitan directives, which in turn generated an archive of commercial information that they hoped could inform policymaking. And some of these written directives, called instructions to bureaucrats, I have put on the slide. The council's investment in this commercial information order reflected its growing commitment to promoting trade as opposed to land ownership as the solution to the core problem of creating sufficient wealth to finance state building projects. In the Privy Council's own directives to its own bureaucrats, the council expounded a view of the imperial economy centered on the collection of information about trade. It instructed its bureaucrats to, as it put it, consider and propound how to remedy inconveniences of the English trade by making due inquiry into the question of how the foreign plantations may be made most useful to the trade and navigation of these kingdoms. Using the documents sent in response to these directives by bureaucrats on the ground, metropolitan administrators collected and recorded the experiences of merchants, governors, and settlers, exchanged information amongst themselves so as to inform decision-making, and inculcated officials into norms of governing practice through written prescriptions. Executive officials also developed systems of organizing and preserving these records so that they could be used to make future policy decisions. In these ways, the early modern English state's information order projected outward into the nascent Atlantic Empire. The metropolitan hubs of this imperial information order were a series of committees that the Privy Council formed in the late 1600s to organize and manage the written information collected about commercial activity in the empire. And in 1696, the council organized these committees into what would become its standing form for most of the 18th century, when it established it as a board of trade. The council acted against a backdrop of an English political world that had changed dramatically during the mid-1600s. The crown's claim to sovereignty in imperial affairs had faced multiple challenges during the 1600s, including from planters and privateers who defied the chartered trading monopolies it had granted to corporations, such as the Royal African Company, colonists who rebelled against the attempted reorganization of provincial government in the North American Northeast into a crown-controlled Dominion of New England, and of particular importance, the challenge posed by Parliament, which challenged royal control over imperial trade by passing the Navigation Acts of 1651, 1660, and 1663, and which had sought to create its own Board of Trade. In establishing this crown-controlled board in the 1690s, the Privy Council worked to reassert the monarchy's control over political economy in the empire by institutionalizing powers to both inquire into and make policy about political economic affairs in the hands of a board of royally appointed administrators. The board inherited custodianship of the papers accumulated by previous Privy Council committees of trade, the primary site for the receipt of incoming correspondence about imperial affairs from colonial officials. The board also served as the administrative hub of written information about current conditions in the empire. Measuring the efficacy of ongoing administrative practices, as described by governors and other officials in the incoming correspondence, against the precedents of its archival holdings, the board applied the form of expertise tied to the control over written information that had been crystallized under Elizabethan administration to the conduct now of imperial rule. It distilled these precedents into written instructions given to bureaucrats upon their appointments to an imperial posting, and mirroring the instructions issued by states and institutions to ambassadors, diplomats, and travelers that trained them to observe and report on political and natural phenomena according to disciplined conventions. The board's instructions codified both executive decrees and royal interpretations of parliamentary legislation into a single document, reviewed and approved by the sovereign's own counselors. The instructions prescribed rules for the conduct of officials and the production of administrative information, especially with regards to trade. Colonial governors were instructed in these documents to constantly correspond with the board and keep it appraised of all occurrences necessary for their information relating either to the laws of trade and navigation or to His Majesty's revenue of customs and other duties under their management. The board's members then examined the incoming correspondence for evidence of governors' compliance and for information concerning the conduct of trade in the colonies. Central to the workings of this imperial information order, yet largely invisible in the decision-making processes of political economic policy, were a coterie of clerics who inhabited the offices of the Board of Trade, which were located in the Palace of Whitehall in South London, and were entrusted with the care and management of these papers. When the Privy Council established the board in 1696, it provided funding for 8 salaried members who conducted the board's regular business and regularly appeared at its meetings, and an 11-person clerical staff, consisting of a secretary, a deputy secretary, 4 clerks ranked in terms of the longevity of their service, 2 office keepers, 2 messengers, and a female cleaner known as the quote unquote necessary woman. These clerks developed a system of filing incoming information from the colonies by geography that allowed them to easily retrieve documents for the use and consultation of government bureaucrats. The clerks created a variety of search technologies, indexes such as the one that I have showed on the slide, copybooks and journals in which they listed the titles of documents according to both a series of subject headings and by dates of creation. This enabled board members, as well as the clerks, to be able to look up information in a kind of search engine, kind of early modern search engine. Junior clerks learned how to manage the papers from the more senior clerks, who were in turn paid more. And so expertise within this information system was transferred from those who had more experience with dealing with the papers and organizing them to the more junior members of the clerical staff. And so when the members of, say, the Privy Council who sat on the board requested information about, for example, what the governor of Virginia had reported back about the rate of a particular tax collected from merchants at the port of Norfolk in, say, 1727, the board's clerks knew exactly how to use cross-references from these indexes on the slide with the actual files in the archive in order to find the particular document where the information was contained. Now, the clerks labored under a strict set of rules. These workplace rules were largely unwritten and learned through practice and apprenticeship. Working in bureaucratic offices meant largely learning by doing, with seniority tied to how long one had been working in an office. This can make it difficult to get much insight into the labor environment of an 18th century bureaucratic workplace. But there are occasional moments in this history when bureaucrats wrote down something of their procedures. In 1764, for example, in the context of making a request to the Privy Council for more money, the board was forced to write down and codify its rules of office procedure. So it did so. And in this written document, the board described how clerks were managed. All clerks were required to attend their duty in the office between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m., as well as at any other time that the board was meeting or any evening when asked. One of the clerks was entrusted with the job of managing the archive of the office's papers and to take special care to ensure the security of the papers by making sure that all books and papers are locked up in their respective places upon arriving to the office in the morning and before departing in the evening, and to make sure that no unauthorized persons were allowed access to the records. The board also specified how clerks were hired. An applicant would be interviewed by the board and asked to provide a specimen of his writing for the board's consideration along with references. Clearly, clerks, like academics, were in constant want of letters of recommendation. The board's membership and its clerks used written records to assert royal control over imperial political economy, especially against the competing authority of Parliament. Emulating earlier administrators who circulated manuscripts and records as authoritative proof of the wisdom of particular policies, the board itself entered into these policy disputes by citing, excerpting, and interpreting records as evidence that its particular policy initiative, namely crown control over the imperial economy, was grounded in the authority of law and history. The board, of course, had the advantage in this regard of unrestricted access to the imperial records, which it enjoyed alongside the rest of the Privy Council, whereas other interested parties, such as members of Parliament, had to obtain conciliar permission to consult the Royal Archive and could only request specific government records. Now, this documentary authority that I've been discussing within the state, within bureaucratic apparatus, was also bolstered by a much broader epistemic environment in the 18th century British Atlantic world, in which political economists, historians, and commentators stressed that truths about political economy were located in paperwork. Not simply within the state, but also in public-facing contexts, subjects across the 18th century British Atlantic world invoked documents as the foundation of their views about the commerce and politics of empire. Like government administrators who claimed that policy wisdom lay in the precedence of state papers, commentators on imperial affairs frequently emphasized that official records, read or obtained through stints of government service or fortuitous social connections, rendered their views, quote unquote, authentic. This sentiment was especially pronounced among 18th century writers of the history of imperial trade and settlement, since they regularly claimed in the prefaces, introductions, and footnotes to their works that their accounts were authentic because they had relied on copies of government papers that they had obtained from imperial officials. The citation and transcription of quote unquote authentic documents and quote unquote authentic papers were means through which public-facing writers, like bureaucrats within the machinery of the state, claimed certain knowledge about affairs imperial. Historical fact, however, was not the only kind derivable from authentic papers. As writers emphasized, such documents also contained definitive knowledge of contemporary commercial affairs. Even outside the halls of government, excellence in the mercantile arts depended on mastering techniques of collecting, preserving, and interpreting written information, or so these people thought. The success of both merchants and states thus hinged within this epistemology upon the proper generation and preservation of written records about the conduct of trade. Merchants and princes had to master the art of merchandising and traffic, the merchant Lewis Roberts explained in 1700. The true mother of the relevant knowledge lay for Lewis in the direct experience of commodities. This experience, Lewis explained, was best gotten by often viewing the rules, customs, and practices through which people exchanged commodities and then committing these observations to writing. The use and custom of noting in this manner, Roberts argued, will make a man, especially young beginners, more skillful and ready in this knowledge, because writing made the impressions in a man's mind necessary to turn him into a talented practitioner and governor of the commercial arts. While a merchant's written observations might initially be rude and undigested or frivolous, the repeated practice of inscription would, over time, both perfecteth skill and helpeth memory, leading the merchant to a more considerate and judicious observation, and thus the better marking of information on paper. Repetitious acts of writing themselves would generate protocols of trust and authentication that would in turn allow the merchant to distinguish between knowledge and misinformation, Roberts advised. This concept of imperial commerce as knowable through the experience contained in reliable written records reached a descriptive apogee in the British Atlantic world before the American Revolution in Adam Anderson's An Historical and Chronological Deduction of the Origin of Commerce, published in 1764. It was to the instrumentality of commerce alone that the greatness of the British Empire was peculiarly indebted, Anderson, a trustee of the colony of Georgia, declared. But the nature of that commercial greatness could not be known through the so-called science of political arithmetic, whose position, promulgated by the once famous but now apparently less authoritative Sir William Petty, had been effectually exploded by dear-bought experience. Instead, Anderson invoked the authority of the royal historiographer Thomas Reimer's grand collection of records known as the Phaedra, a succession of volumes containing transcriptions of diplomatic and commercial treaties and arrangements between England and other states that had begun to be published by the Office of the Secretary of State in 1698. Anderson proclaimed himself indebted to this collection of state papers for both facts about the great commercial interests of the British Empire and correctives to the mistakes made by less authentic writers. For Anderson, and for other political economists who followed or preceded him, historical truth and political economic truth were interlinked by a common foundation in bureaucratic paperwork. Now, adherence to this concept of political economic knowledge emphasized that the Board of Trade's records held particularly valuable insights. In past times, when our Board of Trade and Plantations, which should be styled the Council of Commerce, has been composed of men versed in the commercial art and capable of communicating all due information to the superior offices of state, the commercial writer Thomas Mortimer argued in 1772, Great Britain has ever rose superior to all maritime powers and has extended her commerce and national credit to the remotest parts of the globe. According to Mortimer, the board's attainment of commercial knowledge through communication and information and its deployment of this political wisdom in a glorious administration of the public affairs of the British state determined the empire's success. The potential of bureaucratic records to powerfully substantiate historical and policy claims remained a widely shared epistemic value throughout the 18th century. If you wanted to determine economic fact in this world, the answer to where you'd need to go was clear: the archive. But 3 decades later, Mortimer was singing a different tune. In an 1801 work, Mortimer argued that while an archival approach to commercial governance might have been well adapted to the infant state of our trade, it was by no means suited to the present extensive commerce of Great Britain. Instead, Mortimer wrote, the knowledge required to govern a mature imperial economy lay in the compilation of a single digested, complete mercantile code or body of commercial laws, digested and replacing the plethora of letters, reports, account books, and scraps of paper that the clerks of the Board of Trade had sifted through to find authorities for their policy proposals, replacing it with a uniform published and publicly available code. Other early 19th century writers echoed Mortimer. In order to write even a paragraph in a newspaper on finance, the Scottish banker Walter Boyd noted in the early 1810s, it was conventionally understood that the author should be possessed of certain data, certain authentic documents upon which his reasonings may rest. Yet, even though Boyd admitted that he possessed no authentic documents, he nevertheless insisted that he could still reason about the finances of Great Britain. Why? As Boyd explained, the finances of the kingdom were governed by principles whose existence was not contingent upon their description in writing. Once known, these principles could be used in lieu of records to generate knowledge for policymaking. Even if numerical data continued to be written down on paper, records merely recorded the workings of such principles, which operated to shape political and economic relations like laws of motions shape the physical world, entirely independent from their description in language. Earlier writers, such as Charles Davenant, had invoked non-archival techniques such as political arithmetic, which I briefly discussed earlier, as grounds for making probable claims about matters of political economy. But during the 19th century, a language of exactitude characterized by a lexicon of principles, science, fact, and mechanics came to be attached to non-archival methods of political economic reasoning. Indeed, political economy itself came to be defined as the study of principles that were part of the constitution of man and of the physical world, not the offspring of legislative enactments recorded in government documents, and therefore discernible through a science of fact and experiment comparable to the way physicists derived mechanical principles, as the Encyclopedia Britannica defined the concept of political economy in 1842. This shift manifested itself epistemologically in a growing understanding of political economy as a distinct field of inquiry, especially relative to history, and a decreasing emphasis on the power of written records to generate policy authority. Political economy transformed in these years from a pursuit understood to involve extracting guidance from the archival sources of the past into a mechanical science of deriving principles. To be an expert at political economy no longer meant being an archivist. Instead, it meant knowing these principles and applying them to policy problems. Political economy's shift in the early 19th century toward being seen as a mechanical science was part and parcel of a broader transformation in the human sciences in which archival methods increasingly came to be divorced from the work of governance. This manifested itself not simply in the idea, as I just mentioned, of political economy as a science of principles, but also in the idea that archives themselves had limited bearing upon the work of governance. And thus, that there was no reason to keep archives restricted from public view. Instead, commentators argued that they should be opened up for interested researchers, precisely because, as a writer put it in 1851, government archives had no possible bearing upon public or private business of the present day, which made them safe for public consultation. History, or at least history in the sense of the work of government and administration, came to be severed from each other, and the archive came to be seen as something distinct from political economic reasoning. Rather, the history that came to be embraced by political economists was of a different kind. The whole business of political economy was to study the causes which have thus cooperated to enrich and civilize a nation, the writer Jane Haldeman Marseille observed in 1816. However, Marseille elaborated, although this science was essentially founded upon history, it was not the history of sovereigns, of wars, and of intrigues, but instead of arts, discoveries, and civilization. Subjects not clearly knowable through archives, whose function, of course, was to preserve the documentation of these sovereigns' activities. If an early modern empire had been governed by archivists and historians, modern government would be the province of social scientists who, like physicists, knew the principles upon which the world worked and could apply them to particular policy problems. To conclude, many will be familiar with what the historian Ted Porter has termed the quote, rise of statistical thinking in the 1820s across the Atlantic world, which Porter eloquently defines as the method of reasoning about events in large numbers without being troubled by the intractability of individuals. Much scholarship has elucidated how this form of thinking became the dominant science of government throughout the Western world in the late 19th century. It remains so today, which explains why historians remain by and large skeptical of many of the claims of social scientists, whose thinking reflects a basic assumption that there are enduring structural features of human societies that any particular social or cultural practice can be ascribed to and that ultimately transcend the particularities of social context. Governments, however, have the reverse attitude. They regard historical thinking as largely irrelevant to their own work, but it was not always so. Understanding the present requires tracing not only the ascent of the modes of mathematical rationality now dominating economic and political thought, but also the rise and fall of an earlier archival epistemology of political economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Asheesh, for that deep and very elegant talk. And I want to thank everybody for coming on behalf of my colleagues in the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources and the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies. I hope that we'll be able to continue this lecture series next year, hopefully in person. And I'm very grateful to all of you for coming, and grateful to Asheesh for a great end to the year.